Remember when the world just stopped? During the pandemic, that shared isolation, that psychological weight, it was immense. And it raises a really tough question. How can an author possibly tackle a global crisis like that and offer real, genuine comfort? I mean, comfort that actually works. It's more than just knowing your stuff. It takes deep empathy. That's the tricky path Malavika Kapoor navigates, and that's what we're going to explore today. We're trying something a bit different here, a new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. It's more than just a summary, though we do have that too. This really examines how the author builds their argument, how they gain influence, and how they earn or maybe lose your trust. The idea is to give you better tools to read with sharper insight. Thinking about reading this book, well, this deep dive should definitely help you decide. It's also, I think, great for aspiring writers. If you find this format useful, please let us know. Your feedback really helps us shape what we do next.
And just so you know, you're listening to a unique two-host AI conversation. This is powered by Google's NotebookLM, allowing us to get into some deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
Okay, so today's focus is Malavika Kapoor's nonfiction book, It's Okay to Reach Out for Help. And it's quite specific, really centering on practical self-care, drawing heavily from Indian traditions and wisdom.
Right, so maybe the best place to start is with the basic context, what analysts sometimes call the rhetorical situation. For anyone not familiar, we can use a framework like SOAP Stone. It just helps quickly define the speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, subject, and tone.
Okay, sounds good. Let's quickly unpack those. So the speaker.
That's Malavika Kapoor. She's a well-established psychologist and academic. Her credibility is, well, pretty solid. Decades of research, clinical work in mental health, mostly focused within the Indian context. So that immediately grounds the book in real professional authority.
But it's not just her background, it's the occasion, right? This book wasn't written in some academic ivory tower. It came out during and right after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. It really taps into the urgency of that shared global psychological crisis. It feels like a direct response, not just theory.
Exactly. And that specific occasion really shapes the audience and the purpose. The potential audience is huge. I mean, anyone affected by the pandemic.
Yeah.
But it seems especially aimed at, well, laypersons and maybe mental health professionals who are open to self-care methods that come from indigenous Indian knowledge. The purpose is pretty clear. Inform, definitely comfort, destigmatize asking for help, which is huge, and offer practical coping strategies rooted in familiar cultural ground for many.
Okay, so the subject is self-care, resilience, indigenous wisdom. And the tone comes across as compassionate, hopeful, and definitely instructional. All right, that gives us the what of the book. Now let's shift gears into the analysis, the how. How does she actually translate that context into a message that connects? Let's start with trust, ethos. She's dealing with really vulnerable personal stuff here. How does she earn our trust beyond just having the qualifications?
That's a really good question because just listing credentials can feel cold, maybe a bit clinical, right? Kapoor seems to layer her ethos. Yes, she uses her professional background that establishes competence. But she builds real trust, I think, by relating to the shared anxieties of pandemic life. She doesn't position herself above the reader. It feels more like she's standing alongside them.
But wait, does that heavy reliance on her Indian background potentially limit her authority for someone reading this, say, in the US or Europe, if the expertise feels very localized?
That's a key point, a potential tension. For her primary audience in India, that cultural specificity likely boosts her authority. It signals that her advice isn't just imported theory, it's rooted in familiar cultural stuff, making it feel more credible, more applicable to them. For readers outside that culture, the basis of trust might shift a bit. They'd rely less on the specific cultural nuances and more on the universal psychological principles she pulls from those traditions. So her ethos becomes this blend, really. Academic rigor and cultural authenticity.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's move on to Loger's The Logical Appeal. In a self-help book coming out of a crisis, the advice needs to feel rational, right? Sustainable. Not just feel-good fluff, it needs structure. What makes the logic of her advice feel actionable?
Well, logical structure is what makes the advice practical, what makes it stick. She grounds the solutions in established psychological principles, cognitive behavioral stuff. But crucially, she breaks them down into simple, logically organized steps. For instance, she doesn't just say, be resilient, that's too vague. Instead, she structures advice around, let's call them micro-interventions, small thematic changes. Things like having a structured daily routine or specific breathing exercises. These draw from established frameworks but make the huge task of recovery feel, well, manageable. The logic flows from "this feels overwhelming" to "okay, I can do this one small thing today."
Yeah, that step-by-step approach from abstract fear to a concrete task sounds vital. But logic alone often isn't enough to get someone who's really struggling, maybe depressed or anxious, to actually do something. Which brings us to pathos, the emotional connection. How does it's okay to reach out for help connect on that level? How does she use emotion to fuel the action her logic calls for?
Oh, the emotional appeal is absolutely central, and she achieves it mainly through narrative, storytelling. Gapper uses these vivid case examples, really detailed scenarios, often drawn from her own clinical work or maybe observations during the pandemic. And this creates immediate empathy. When you read these stories of suffering, it kind of universalizes the reader's own pain. You think, okay, it's not just me feeling this.
So the pathos isn't about manipulation, it's more about validation, showing resilience alongside the suffering.
Exactly that. When you read detailed stories about other people navigating loss or burnout or anxiety, it takes the abstract idea of mental health issues and makes it a shared human thing, something that can be worked through. It gets the reader emotionally invested in a positive outcome, hopefully empowering them to actually follow the structured path, the logos that she's laid out.
And that power of storytelling, it must rely heavily on her writing style. When we look at Kapoor's style, her word choices, her sentences, how does she manage to talk about complex psychological ideas without, overwhelming an audience that's already stressed out?
She's clearly intentional about using accessible language, non-technical. Her main goal seems to be clarity, inclusivity. The syntax, the sentence structure, it's pretty straightforward. Especially when giving advice, she often uses shorter declarative sentences. And this choice feels strategic. If the language was dense, academic, full of jargon, that would just be another barrier for someone already hesitant. So the simple style acts almost like a psychological cushion. It makes sure that reading about getting help doesn't become stressful itself.
Let's dig back into what makes this book really distinct. The cultural illusion. This seems like a core part of the analysis. We've said the Indian traditions make it credible for the core audience, but let's push on that a bit. What specific advantages do these indigenous methods offer compared to, say, standard Western CBT approaches in this specific pandemic context?
Well, one primary benefit might be the emphasis on community and holistic well-being. That's often really deeply woven into indigenous wisdom traditions. Western psychology can sometimes feel very focused on the individual struggle. Kapoor, using these cultural examples, seems to reframe self-care partly as a collective thing. She draws on specific practices that highlight social connection, family support, and locally understood ways of managing emotions that just feel more organic and familiar to that audience.
Can you give a concrete example? How does she translate that cultural wisdom into a specific psychological point?
Sure. So instead of just talking abstractly about mindfulness, she might reference specific, culturally known forms of meditation, or perhaps even devotional practices common in Indian households. And she uses these not just as religious acts, but points out their psychological function, how they help with grounding, with focus. For a reader immersed in that culture, that's like a massive shortcut. They don't need to learn some brand new technique. They just need to recognize the psychological benefit in something they already know.
Okay, so there's a trade-off. Applicability versus universality. The specificity makes it resonate deeper for the target audience, but the international reader, they might need to do a little mental translation, seeing the universal principle behind the specific local practice.
That sums it up perfectly, I think. The core universal ideas, stress reduction, healthy routines, needing social support, those are absolutely there and valuable for anyone. But the indigenous methods, they add this rich, personalized layer that makes the advice feel more potent, maybe less intimidating, for the primary readership. People who might perhaps be a bit wary of advice that feels imported from a very different cultural setting.
Right. Before we synthesize all this, maybe just a quick check on integrity. Given how emotional self-help can be, especially during a crisis, did the analysis show any signs of, well, manipulative tactics or pushing emotional buttons too hard?
No, not really. The book seems to maintain a high level of integrity. It steers clear of the kind of hyper-sensationalism you sometimes see in self-help. It feels respectful of the reader's autonomy. The focus stays firmly on honest encouragement and providing supportive, grounded steps rather than, promising miracle cures.
So, pulling it all together for the reader, the book seems to succeed because Kapoor manages this really tricky balance. She combines her established authority, that ethos, with deep cultural empathy, pathos, and a practical, clear, logical structure, logos. She effectively makes talking about mental health more accessible.
And just a quick note here, we really encourage reflection and rational thought over at Mindful Moments. That's our YouTube channel. We offer AI-powered book analysis, summaries, critiques. We really aim to provide the context you need to understand books more fully.
Malavika Kapoor's work really does stand out, not just as something written about the pandemic, but maybe as a model for how psychological care can be framed, both collective and personal. And doing that while honoring India's diverse traditions. That empathetic voice, the actionable advice, it clearly strikes a chord with people looking for stability when everything felt so unstable.
Yeah, we've seen how effective culturally grounded wisdom can be here. Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to chew on. To what extent do self-care strategies need to be adapted to local realities? Things like resource availability, specific cultural norms or taboos. And conversely, what truly universal principles can be pulled out and applied effectively across any culture, regardless of the local details? It's a complex question.
Definitely something to think about. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Please subscribe, share this deep dive if you found it useful, and maybe purchase the book via the link. And remember, always try to think rationally.
And don't forget to check out the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.